She found out on a Tuesday. Not because of a dramatic phone call. Not because she walked in on something. She found out because of a grocery delivery. 2 toothbrushes. Same brand. Her exact shade. Side by side in a brown paper bag. She stood in the kitchen for almost 4 minutes holding them, one in each hand, trying to decide which explanation felt most likely. The auto-refill glitch. The website error. The thing her husband would laugh about later and say, "You know how those subscription services are." She chose the explanation. She put one toothbrush in the cabinet. She threw the other one away. She didn't mention it at dinner. That was 6 weeks before her world came apart. Before we get to the end, you need to understand what the beginning looked like. Because if you don't understand what was real, what felt real, at least, then none of the rest of it will make sense. Daniel Mercer was 38 years old. He was a hospital administrator at a mid-sized regional medical center in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. He wore Oxford shirts buttoned all the way up. He kept a paper calendar on his desk even though the hospital used digital scheduling. He liked the physical act of writing things down, he said. He liked things he could see. His colleagues called him the most reliable person they'd ever worked with. Not the flashiest. Not the funniest. But the one who did what he said he would do, when he said he would do it. Every time. The kind of person whose consistency you stop noticing because it becomes the furniture of your life. Emma had married him 9 years ago in a small ceremony in her mother's backyard. She was a freelance copy editor, she worked from home, she set her own hours, she had a way of noticing the specific kind of silence that falls in a house when something is being left unsaid. 9 years in, she would tell you their marriage was not spectacular. But she would also tell you it was stable, which, after watching her parents' marriage detonate when she was 14, felt like the greater miracle. They had a shared Google Calendar. This is a small thing that becomes important. Emma had set it up in their second year of marriage, because Daniel traveled occasionally for work and she wanted to be able to see his schedule without texting him every time. He'd accepted the invitation immediately. He never objected. He never had any reason to. Tuesday was his late night at the hospital, budget reviews, he said. Wednesday he was usually home by 6. They had dinner together 4 nights a week. They watched 2 shows in parallel, one serious, one comfortable, and they developed a wordless negotiation system for which one they watched depending on how tired each of them was. She would recognize, later, that the wordless negotiation was a sign of how well they knew each other. That kind of knowing takes years to build. That people who build that kind of knowing don't just do it accidentally. This is what Emma would spend months trying to reconcile, that the men she married, the one who knew how she took her coffee, who remembered the name of her 3rd-grade teacher, who held her hand during her mother's cancer treatments without her having to ask, that men had been living 2 lives simultaneously for nearly 3 years. The calendar was meticulous. That was what struck Emma when she looked back at it, not just that it had been maintained, but that it had been maintained so precisely. Every Tuesday, budget review, staying until 7:30. Every 3rd Monday, site visit, Memorial Branch. Quarterly entries labeled, Regional Admin Conference, with hotel names and cities. Portland. Seattle. Sacramento. San Francisco. All of it time-stamped, color-coded, logically consistent. He used blue for hospital commitments, green for personal appointments, gray for travel. Emma had never cross-referenced the calendar against anything. Why would she? The point of trusting someone is that you stop auditing them. Surveillance and intimacy don't coexist, you have to choose which one you're practicing. She had chosen intimacy. She believed she was sharing a life with someone. She did not know she was also sharing a calendar with someone who had become very, very good at color-coding a fiction. The specific irony, the one she'd turn over in her mind for months, was that the calendar was her idea. She had set it up because she trusted him. She wanted to feel connected to his schedule when he was away. She never imagined it would be used as a stage set. A prop. Something that made the lie look tidy from the outside. Later, a friend would say to her, "But didn't you ever check it against what he actually did?" And Emma would look at her with something between grief and fury and say, "That's not what trust is. Trust is when you stop needing to check." What made Daniel difficult to suspect, and harder to leave once Emma suspected him, was that he was genuinely good at being present when he was there. He remembered things. He remembered that Emma's best friend had a complicated relationship with her mother and would ask the right follow-up questions months later. He remembered that Emma went through a period every January where she found it hard to get out of bed, not depression exactly, more like a protracted reluctance, and he would quietly make sure the kettle was boiled and her desk lamp was on before she came downstairs. He didn't announce this. He didn't ask for credit. He just did it. This is what Emma couldn't stop thinking about when the truth started to surface. A man who pays the kind of attention to the people he loves, what does it mean when that same man has been systematically lying to you for 3 years? Does the attention make the lie worse? Or does the lie make the attention hollow? Does it unmake every small kindness? Or does it just make them impossible to read clearly anymore? She didn't have an answer. She's not sure she has one now. She thinks some questions are not answerable, they're just things you have to carry. But this is what she knew. 9 years in the weeks before the grocery delivery, she trusted Daniel Mercer with the parts of herself she didn't show anyone else. And he had accepted that trust. He had held it carefully. And somewhere, at some point, in a way she still doesn't fully understand, he had quietly kept it for himself while building something else elsewhere. It started, in the way that these things always start, with something small enough to dismiss. The grocery delivery arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Emma had set up the account 3 years earlier. She'd added a few recurring items to the basket, and it auto-renewed each month. Toothbrushes were among them, soft bristle, the specific mint and white ones she preferred. 1 toothbrush per delivery, every 3 months. This delivery contained 2. She stood in the kitchen and looked at them for a long time. She thought about the delivery service's website. She'd had issues before with auto-refill settings, duplicated items. She thought about whether she'd accidentally clicked something. She thought about whether Daniel had logged into the account and ordered something, though he never touched the grocery account. She thought about all of these things in rapid, slightly frantic succession, and then she thought, stop it. It's a glitch. Daniel came home at 7:15. She mentioned it over dinner, lightly, almost as a joke. The grocery thing sent 2 toothbrushes. He looked up. He smiled. Those subscription services, he said. I swear they double charge everything. He went back to his food. He didn't ask to see the receipt. He didn't suggest returning it. She believed him. Or she chose to believe him, which is not the same thing. The second toothbrush went in the trash. The first went in the cabinet. Life continued. But something had changed in the way a glass changes when it develops a hairline crack, invisibly, irreversibly, held together only until the next small pressure. The next thing she noticed was his phone battery. Daniel always came home with his phone at 12%. Not always, not literally every single time, but often enough that Emma started to notice it as a pattern. He'd plug in immediately when he got through the door, the charger cable already in his hand before he'd taken off his coat. She'd thought about it absently and concluded he was just the kind of person who didn't think to charge during the day. Except that he had a charging pad on his desk at the hospital. She'd bought it for him the Christmas before last. Wireless, the good kind. He'd been genuinely pleased. She remembered him testing it, smiling. She thought about the charging pad one morning while loading the dishwasher, the way the mind goes somewhere randomly, following an association, and she thought, if his phone is always dead when he gets home, why isn't he using the charging pad at work? And then she thought, maybe he's just not at his desk enough. Maybe he's in meetings. That would make sense. She didn't say anything. She filed the thought under, probably nothing, and closed the dishwasher and poured herself another coffee. The theory she didn't let herself form, the one that lived at the periphery of these small observations, that she kept refusing to look at directly, was this: a phone at 12% when you arrive home suggests you've been charging it somewhere else recently. It suggests you plugged it in, waited for a partial charge, then unplugged and drove home. It suggests that wherever you were, you needed your battery alive, and then you needed it partially dead again before you walked in your own front door. She didn't form this theory. Not yet. She was still in the stage of explanation. She had a lot of small explanations and they were holding. Emma was a copy editor. Her work required her to notice things that other people missed, the wrong verb tense in a sentence, a character who appears in Chapter 3 but disappears without explanation in Chapter 7, a scene set in autumn that becomes inexplicably summer 2 pages later. She had spent years training herself to pay attention to consistency, to notice when the internal logic of a world had been violated. She noticed, in early March, that Daniel had started shaving every morning before work. He had never shaved every morning. He shaved Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, a routine so reliable it had become invisible. But now he was in the bathroom with the door closed every day, sometimes twice a day, and she could hear the electric razor through the wall, and she thought, he must have a meeting. He must have something. She didn't ask. She noticed that he'd started going to the gym. This wasn't suspicious on its own. He'd talked for years about wanting to be more consistent. But he'd begun going at 6 in the morning, before she was awake. He'd come back showered and dressed before she made coffee. When she said, the first time, "You're up early," he'd said, trying to get ahead of the day. It was a thing people said. It was completely plausible. She noticed that his cologne had changed. This was the kind of thing a woman notices and cannot explain why without sounding like she's cataloging her husband's behavior. She mentioned it once, "Is that a new cologne?" And he said his old one had run out and he'd tried something different. He offered her his wrist to smell. She leaned in. It was nice. She felt briefly foolish for having asked. None of these things were evidence. None of them even added up to a shape she could point at. They were just off. Like a song played slightly too slowly. You feel something before you can name what it is. The day Emma decided to look, not investigate, she told herself, just look, came on a Wednesday in late March. Daniel was at the hospital for what the calendar said was a budget committee meeting. He'd be home by 6:30. Emma was at her desk editing a manuscript about grief, which she would later find either darkly funny or unbearably appropriate, depending on the day. She picked up her phone. She opened Google Maps, the shared location feature they'd turned on years ago, casually, after a minor incident of miscommunication. She told herself she was just checking how far away he was because she was thinking about whether to start dinner. His location pin was not at the hospital. It was 1.3 miles from their house, in a residential neighborhood she didn't know well. A side street. She zoomed in. An apartment building, a 4-story, gray brick building with a parking garage and a small lobby. She put the phone down on the desk, face down. She sat very still. She thought, his location is off. The GPS is bad. That happens in cities, it happens in parking garages, there are 100 explanations. Then she thought, but the hospital is north and that building is east. These are not nearby. This is not a GPS error. She picked the phone up and looked again. The pin hadn't moved. She closed the app. She went back to the manuscript. She edited 4 pages about a woman sorting through her dead father's belongings, and she did not think about the apartment building, and that was a lie she told herself very efficiently for about 40 minutes before she put the manuscript down and opened Google Maps again. The pin was back at the hospital. He came home at 6:32. He asked what she wanted for dinner. She said she'd already started something. He said great. He kissed her on the cheek. She noticed the weight of that kiss, how it landed in a specific way now, an ordinary thing suddenly freighted. She drove past it 3 days later. She told herself she was taking a different route. She told herself it was curiosity, not investigation. The building was called Heron Court. It was the kind of building that was neither expensive nor cheap, mid-range, clean, maintained. A ficus plant visible through the lobby windows. A keycard entry. A row of buzzers beside the door, each one with a small white label. She drove past without stopping. She went home. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat with the cup and looked at the wall and did something she was becoming quite skilled at. She held a terrible thought at arm's length and didn't quite let herself finish it. That evening, while Daniel was watching television, she Googled the building. Heron Court Apartments. Studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom. Pet friendly. Parking included. Monthly rates listed. She thought about the rates for a long time. Then she thought about their bank account. She and Daniel had a joint account for household expenses. But Daniel also had a separate personal account, money from before they were married, he'd always said, that he kept for his own incidentals. He paid for his own gym membership from it, his own dry cleaning, occasional gifts he didn't want her to see. She had never thought to question this. It was normal. Lots of couples had separate personal accounts alongside joint ones. She thought about the personal account in a way she'd never thought about it before. Not with accusation. Just with a new kind of awareness, the kind that comes from realizing that a door you thought was simply a door might be, in fact, the entrance to something much larger. She closed the laptop. She went and sat beside Daniel on the couch. He put his arm around her. She leaned against him. The specific weight of another person's body against yours, she felt it then with an acuity that was almost painful. She thought, this is either the most comforting thing in the world or the most devastating thing in the world. And I don't know yet which one it is. Emma was not someone who would characterize herself as a snoop. She had never read Daniel's texts. She had never logged into his email. She had a deep, almost principled aversion to the idea of surveillance in a marriage. She'd watched her parents tear each other apart with exactly that kind of forensic attention, each one building a case against the other, each one living in their own home as if it were a crime scene. She had wanted something different. She had built something different. She had believed she'd built it with someone who wanted the same things. So when she looked at the credit card statement, their joint household card, the one she had every right to see, she told herself she wasn't snooping. She was just looking at something she was entitled to look at. She just happened, for the first time in 3 years, to look at it carefully. The statement was clean. Groceries. Her pharmacy. His dry cleaner. The streaming subscriptions. A restaurant she recognized, their favorite Thai place, the one on Morrison Street. Nothing unusual. She went back further. 6 months. A year. She found, on average, 2 to 3 charges per month to Home Essentials Direct, between $40 and $90 each. She didn't recognize the vendor. She Googled it. Home Essentials Direct was an online household goods retailer, cleaning supplies, toiletries, kitchen items, bedding. She thought about their home. The cleaning supplies they bought locally. The toiletries she ordered from the subscription service. The bedding they'd had for years. She looked around their apartment with fresh eyes. She thought, I haven't bought any of this. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she did something methodical and almost clinical. She made a list of every Home Essentials Direct charge for the past 18 months. Date, amount, total. The total was just over $2,000. 18 months. $2,000 in household goods. For a household that already had everything it needed. She didn't confront him that night. Or the next night. Or the one after that. She thought about this a great deal later, about what it meant that she had evidence, or something that felt like the shape of evidence, and she still didn't say anything. People assume, from the outside, that confrontation is the natural next move. You find something alarming. You ask about it. That's what you do. But Emma understood something that most people only understand from the inside of it. The moment you ask the question, you cannot unask it. The moment you say, I've been looking at the credit card and I want to know what Home Essentials Direct is, the marriage becomes a place where you've said that. It becomes the kind of marriage where that question existed. And if you're wrong, if there's a completely rational explanation, then you've also become the kind of person who looked at the credit card and made a list. And you can never fully undo that. She was also aware, in a way she could barely look at, that she might not be wrong. And if she wasn't wrong, then the question wasn't just about a credit card. It was the beginning of something much larger. Something she didn't know how to survive yet. So she didn't ask. She kept the list in her notes app, labeled Edit Revisions, so she'd never accidentally open it in front of him. She went to bed. She listened to him sleep. He slept the way he always slept, deeply, without agitation, one hand on his chest. She thought, this is either the sleep of an innocent person or the sleep of someone who has so thoroughly compartmentalized that one half of his life doesn't trouble the other. She didn't know which one. She wasn't sure she could tell from the outside. She wasn't sure there was a way to tell. It was her friend Nadia who suggested she actually go to the hospital. Not in an accusatory way, Nadia didn't know everything yet, only fragments, but she said, over coffee on a Saturday, why don't you bring him lunch sometime? He always says you never visit. Emma had thought about this. She'd thought about Daniel's face if she appeared in his office doorway with a sandwich from the place he liked. She went on a Tuesday. Budget review night. She brought sandwiches in a paper bag, the kind from the place on 5th he'd mentioned last month, and she drove to the hospital and she parked in the visitor lot and she went to the administrative offices on the 3rd floor. The receptionist at the front desk, a young man named Tyler, according to his badge, looked up when she said she was looking for Daniel Mercer's office. Tyler paused. He checked something on his screen. He said, "Daniel Mercer isn't in today." Emma said, "He should be, he has a budget review meeting." Tyler looked again. He said, carefully, "I don't have any record of a budget review today. Mr. Mercer submitted a remote work request. He's working off-site." Emma thanked Tyler. She took the paper bag with the sandwiches. She walked back through the lobby, through the sliding doors, into the parking lot. She stood beside her car. It was 4:15 in the afternoon. The weather was cold and overcast. She looked at her phone. His location said he was at home. She was 20 minutes from home. She called him. He answered on the second ring. He said, "Hey, what's up?" She said she was just calling. He said he was in the middle of something, could he call her back? She said sure. He said great. He hung up. She drove home. The house was empty. She went back to Google Maps. The pin had moved. He was at Heron Court. She sat with it for 2 weeks. The pin on the map, the empty hospital floor, Tyler's careful face, the paper bag of sandwiches she'd ended up leaving on the passenger seat. She'd told Nadia. She'd told no one else. Nadia had said, "You need to know." And Emma had said, "I know I need to know. I just need to know how to know." Which was not a coherent sentence, but Nadia understood what she meant. She went to Heron Court on a Thursday morning when Daniel's calendar said, "Remote work day, all day." She drove there and parked across the street and sat in the car for 11 minutes. Then she got out. She walked up to the building. She stood at the row of buzzers. She looked at the names on the labels. Unit 2B, M. Caldwell. Unit 3A, T and J. Osei. Unit 4C, D. Mercer. D. Mercer. His last name. His initial. On a buzzer. On a building she'd never heard of. On an apartment she had no knowledge of. His name, printed on a white label, in the building the GPS pin had led her to, on a street she'd driven past 3 times in the past month trying not to arrive at exactly this conclusion. She didn't press the buzzer. She walked back to her car. She sat in it for a long time. Then she drove to a coffee shop 5 blocks away and sat at a table by the window and ordered a black coffee and drank it very slowly and tried to understand what her life was now. She hired someone. She's not proud of this part, or rather, she holds it with the particular ambivalence of someone who knows they did what the situation required while also wishing the situation had never required it. A licensed private investigator. A woman in her late 40s named Carol who had an office above a dry cleaner and who asked Emma, at their first meeting, "Do you want to know or do you want to be certain?" Emma said she needed to be certain. Carol said that was usually the answer. Carol's report came back in 8 days. Daniel had been renting the apartment at Heron Court for 2 years and 9 months. He paid the rent from his personal account. He had furnished it, completely, functionally, with everything a person needs to live somewhere. Bed. Couch. Kitchen table. He had utilities in his name. A mailbox key. A parking space. He spent, on average, 4 nights per week there. Tuesdays were the most consistent, the budget review nights. Occasional Wednesdays. Random weekday afternoons when his calendar showed remote work days. Carol also confirmed what Emma had not allowed herself to wonder about directly: there was another person. A woman named Sasha. Mid-30s. A nurse. Emma later found this almost too much to absorb, given where Daniel worked. They had apparently met at the hospital. Carol had a photograph. Emma asked not to see it. Then she asked to see it. Then she looked at it for a long time and then she handed it back. The relationship had been ongoing for approximately 3 years. The apartment had come later, she was not clear on the exact timeline. It didn't really matter. 3 years. 2 years and 9 months. It predated the toothbrushes, the battery, the cologne, the gym. It predated all the clues by a long margin. Emma sat in Carol's office above the dry cleaner and she thought about the shared Google Calendar, blue for hospital commitments, green for personal appointments, gray for travel, and she understood that she had been reading fiction for 3 years and had believed it was her life. She gave herself 3 days before she said anything. She needed to know what she wanted from the conversation before she had it. She'd seen people have the confrontation without knowing what they wanted from it, and the result was usually noise, a lot of emotion and accusation and half-truths, and at the end of it nothing was clearer. She made some decisions. She would not yell. Not because she didn't want to, she wanted to, with a ferocity that surprised her, but because she knew herself well enough to know that yelling would move the conversation into a place where Daniel's response to her emotion became the subject, rather than what he'd actually done. She'd watched this happen to her parents. She wasn't going to let it happen to her. She would not ask him to explain himself. She would tell him what she knew. All of it, the location pin, the hospital visit, Tyler, the buzzer, Carol's report. She would lay it out calmly and completely and then she would wait. She practiced this, alone in the apartment, on a Thursday afternoon while he was at work. She said it aloud, to a chair, which felt absurd and necessary in equal measure. She thought about Nadia's question from 2 weeks earlier, what do you want to happen? She still didn't fully know. She thought she might not know until she was in the room with him. She did it on a Friday evening when they'd both be home. She waited until after dinner. She waited until the ordinary things were done, dishes, phones put away, the television off. And then she said his name. He looked up from where he was sitting. She said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. Her voice was completely even. Later she would describe this as the strangest sensation, the disconnect between how she felt, which was like standing in the center of something that was collapsing, and how she sounded, which was like someone reading a prepared statement. She told him everything she knew. The location pin. The hospital. Tyler. The buzzer. She told him she'd hired someone and she told him what Carol had found. She kept her hands folded in her lap and she watched his face. He did not move for a very long time. He had the expression of someone watching something irreversible happen, not surprise exactly, because on some level he had known this conversation would eventually exist, but something more like a kind of awful settling, a man who has been holding something up for a very long time finally putting it down. Then he put his hands over his face. And then he said, I'm sorry. Just that. For a long time. I'm sorry. She waited. She said, I need more than that. What followed was not a fight. There was no screaming, no thrown objects, no dramatic revelation. It was two people sitting at a kitchen table for 3 hours, one of them trying to explain something that had no good explanation and the other one trying to understand something she had no framework for. He told her it had started 3 years ago. He told her he had not intended for it to become what it became. He told her, and this was the thing that she found most difficult to hold, that he had loved her throughout it all. That it had not been about loving her less. She told him she couldn't process that. He said he understood. She said she wasn't sure he did. She asked him whether he intended to end it. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said he didn't know. She took a breath. She said, then I think I know what has to happen. The first week after is not something Emma talks about easily. Not because it was the worst she'd felt, she'd feel worse later, in some ways, when the numbness wore off, but because it was so profoundly strange. Daniel moved out within 4 days. He was efficient about it. He took what was clearly his and left the rest, and he did not make the process harder than it needed to be. He was, and this was the thing that kept snagging her, the detail that didn't fit the narrative she was trying to build, he was decent about it. He was considerate and careful and he did not argue about anything. He said he was sorry every time he saw her. She stopped responding to it because she didn't know what to do with it. She told her mother first. Her mother cried. Emma felt oddly responsible for her mother's crying, which was not a helpful feeling. She told 2 close friends. She told them what she needed from them, which was not advice, it was just the ability to say out loud what had happened and have people hear it. Both of them did this well. She did not tell her colleagues. She did not post anything. She did not change anything about her public life, not immediately, because she needed some time when the world outside her apartment behaved as if everything was still the same. She needed the coffee shop where she worked in the mornings to not know. She needed the grocery store to still be just a grocery store. She found, in those first days, that she was most devastated not when she thought about Daniel specifically but when she thought about ordinary future things, holidays, the trip they'd planned for autumn, the apartment they'd talked about eventually buying. The grief was less about what had happened and more about what was no longer going to happen. The future she'd been living toward had simply been revised without her. She went through a period, she's honest about this, of blaming herself. Not for his choices, she was clear on whose choices those were. But for the months of not asking. For the 17 explanations she'd given the evidence before she'd allowed herself to actually see it. She thought about all the moments she'd almost said something, the toothbrushes, the battery, the credit card. She thought about the discomfort she'd felt and then swallowed. She thought about the enormous effort she had put into not knowing, and she felt something between grief and fury at herself for it. Nadia told her, gently and firmly, that this was a misunderstanding of what she'd actually done. You weren't avoiding the truth, Nadia said. You were being a person who trusted the person she married. Those aren't the same thing. Emma heard this but couldn't fully absorb it yet. Some things you hear long before you can use them. She thought about the question she'd been asking herself for weeks, how do you live inside a marriage for 9 years and not see this? And the honest answer, the one she arrived at slowly and reluctantly, was that you don't see it because the person you married has made a decision not to let you see it. It's not a failure of perception. It's the success of a deception. She was not responsible for his choices. But she would spend a long time sitting with the discomfort of having been someone who almost chose not to know, and learning to be gentle with herself about that, too. People kept asking her the same question, in different forms. Why did he do it? What was he looking for? What was wrong with your marriage? She didn't have a clean answer. She's not sure one exists. What she came to think, slowly, over months, was that the question itself was the wrong shape. It assumed that there was something missing, some gap that required filling, some deficit in their marriage that explained what happened. And the deeply unsettling truth was that she didn't believe that. Their marriage had not been perfect. No marriage is. But it had been real. It had been good. She had not been unhappy. She had not been neglecting him. There was no obvious wound that the affair neatly explains. Which meant the explanation had to live somewhere inside Daniel himself, in some combination of avoidance and appetite and compartmentalization that she couldn't fully access and maybe never would. Some people build second lives not because their first life is lacking but because they have found a way to want both. They have developed a capacity to hold two realities without the dissonance becoming unbearable. Until the dissonance does become unbearable. Until a grocery delivery arrives with 2 toothbrushes. She stopped trying to understand it fully. Not out of resignation, out of the recognition that some things cannot be understood from the outside. You can hold the shape of a lie. You cannot hold the inside of the person who told it. He did end the relationship with Sasha. Emma learned this through a mutual acquaintance at the hospital, months later, without having asked. She didn't know what to do with this information and ultimately decided it wasn't hers to do anything with. He reached out twice in the months after. Once to say he was sorry again, this time in a longer, written message that she read 4 times and then didn't respond to. Once to ask if she wanted to talk. She didn't. She has thought about him differently at different points in the recovery. There were months when she hated him with a completeness that surprised her, not a fiery, active hatred but a cold, precise one. There were months when she felt sorry for him in a way that also surprised her, because she'd understood something about compartmentalization by then and about what it costs to live that way. There were months when she felt almost nothing. She doesn't think of him as a monster. She thinks of him as someone who made choices, repeated, sustained, deliberate choices, while also being someone she genuinely loved for 9 years. She holds both things simultaneously. Not because it's comfortable. Because it's true. She's not a different person. She wants to be clear about that because she's encountered the narrative, in books, in conversations, in the well-meaning things people say when they don't know what else to offer, the narrative that a betrayal of this magnitude changes you into someone stronger. Someone wiser. Someone who has, in some meaningful way, grown from the experience. She doesn't want to give that story. She thinks that story is mostly for people who aren't inside it. What she can say is this: she trusts differently now. Not less. Not more. Differently. She has a more honest relationship with what trust actually is, which is not the absence of doubt, but the sustained choice to believe in someone despite the possibility of being wrong. She made that choice for 9 years. She doesn't regret it. She regrets that the person she made it with didn't make it back. She has also learned something about herself and discomfort. About what it feels like to stand at the edge of a terrible knowledge and choose, again and again, to walk away from it. She has learned that this is a very human thing, not a weakness, not a pathology, but a form of self-protection that has limits. And she has learned to sit with discomfort a little more. To look at the hairline crack before it spreads. She still uses a shared calendar. She has, with the careful, tentative tenderness of someone who has been hurt and has decided to try again anyway, started dating someone. She doesn't track his location. She hasn't set it up. She's working on the difference between vigilance and trust. She thinks it might take a while. She thinks that's probably okay. She threw away the second toothbrush on a Tuesday evening in March, and she didn't think about it again for 6 weeks. This is the thing she comes back to most, not as a failure, but as a reminder. Of how easily ordinary life absorbs the extraordinary. Of how a marriage contains so much noise, so much routine, so much familiar texture that a lie can hide inside it for years if the person telling the lie is careful enough. She doesn't know what Heron Court looks like from the inside. She never pressed the buzzer. She chose not to, chose to know what she needed to know from the outside, and to leave that particular door closed. Sometimes she thinks about the apartment. The bed he bought for it. The kitchen table. The parking space. She thinks about all the mornings she woke up in their home while he was already somewhere else, building a life she had no part in, and she tries to understand what it means to share a life with someone and also not share it at all. She hasn't arrived at an understanding. She's not sure she will. But she's stopped expecting one. That, she's discovered, is its own kind of peace.